Join us in Cross Section as we discuss, should the UK follow Australia in banning social media for under 16s? What are your thoughts on that? Then we discuss all these political defections. Everybody seems to be changing party. Are we seeing a realignment of British politics? And then finally, we discuss the significant rise in abortion statistics here in the UK. What are the implications and how do we as the church respond? Well, hello and welcome back to Cross Section, where we are all live in the studio together. Hello, Alicia.
Hello, Peter. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Fresh
Not
off
in
the
navy.
plane.
I was
Not
hoping to
in
match
navy.
today, but
If I had known,
that's
if
the
I got the
signature
memo,
colour.
But we have to look distinctive. So
We're
I'm
not
black.
coordinating our
Danny's
outfits.
in black top.
Yeah, I
as
know.
well.
This is unusual.
and I'm
And hello,
black.
Danny, too.
Hi.
It's lovely to be here in the studio. It's all good. We're all together. It's going to be more chaotic. It should be easier when we're all together.
Mhm.
So if you're watching, obviously you can see that I have made it to London. They let me here every once in a while. If you're listening, I've just told you that. It is a slow news week. Not. So we're going to do our best to get through a couple of different stories that are going on. If you are listening and want to know, we'll talk about some of the abortion stats that were released. We will be talking about a social media ban for under 16s that's being discussed. We'll be talking about political defections. We can't say who and what because they keep happening every day. So we'll see. Danny's going to lead us in that. We will say, but I'm not going to headline them now because by the time this goes out, there'll be more probably. But we'll talk about what that's doing. But I've asked you each to pick a story that we're not covering as a little kickoff, a little cultural story or something in the news that caught your eye. So, Alicia.
So yeah, this is not a spoiler alert for those who are following and watching the Traitors. But of course, in this season, we have two contestants, openly gay. We have Stephen, we have Matt from Northern Ireland, I believe, I understand. Yeah. And both have shared on the episode about their journey of growing up in a religious community and the challenges and struggles of kind of coming out on their sexuality and the challenges of that. And in many ways, it's kind of, is there a more of an activist or cultural conversation again around should there be a ban on conversion therapy, and using these two testimonies as a case point of, although it's not a policy conversation, it's very much still a cultural conversation on the role of faith, sexuality, and how to engage in that space. So just wanted to bring that to
Is
the
there
fore.
any chat in Westminster of it, or is it largely dead given everything else going on?
There are regular questions that keep going to the minister that's responsible for trans inclusion kind of policy. But in many ways, in terms of a legislative draft for legislation commitment, it's kind of, they're kind of holding out on that point.
So in theory, they've said they will introduce draft legislation before the end of this session, which will be at the end of April.
Never-ending session?
It finishes at the end of April. So that's their commitment. That is still their commitment. We have seen no sign of this emerging yet, but I'm not going to predict anything.
Yes. Right. That's enough of you piggybacking. I'm allowed to piggyback on other people's stories. You're not. Sounds good, but that was helpful. Right. What's your story, Danny?
Well, we're recording on Tuesday morning.
You're saying.
I just thought I needed to put that on the record because geopolitics is changing by the minute. I woke up this morning to President Trump very aggressively criticizing the UK government's deal over the Chagos Islands after the US had supported the deal that had been reached. The Chagos Islands deal is hugely controversial, but this also is off the back of Trump's commitment to get hold of Greenland by seemingly any means possible, whether that's through negotiation or the threat of military action. A very small expeditionary force from NATO countries, including one British officer, travelled to Greenland, and that sparked tariffs being introduced in the next couple of weeks, 10% rising to 25%. Is this just a threat to try and spark people into action? It is chaos on the global order. Global leaders, not Keir Starmer, we think, will be meeting in Davos for the World Economic Forum this week, and any other subjects are down the agenda now, and it's all about Greenland.
Right, so two things. One, you totally confused me because I thought you were going to do the other story.
Well, it's all linked together.
You were going to link to the other story. So I think the pull behind the curtain for me on the Davos is Trump is deconstructing the norms of international way of operating He's just basically doing the woke thing on the other side of the coin. Like, he is deconstructing the normal way of operating. So I did finally watch Nuremberg this week. And just well, it's an okay film, but the story behind it, I think, is fantastic. Ultimately, that's where international rule of law is set up. And he is deconstructing that. And so he is just doing exactly the same as many on the left, I think, did with a whole series of other things around marriage, family, gender, sex, all these things. And he's now deconstructing a whole different set of norms. And I think that's where the chaos is coming from. Whether it's intentional in that sense, like thought out philosophically by his advisors, or whether he's just doing it because he can.
Well, I think there's certainly a bit of, a business type, if they don't like what I'm doing, I'm going to hit them economically. I'm going to try and bully them economically into agreeing with something. Will he follow through on the tariffs? He may do.
Brutalist capitalism is one phrase it's used for, isn't it? But I think it's more than that. I think there's a chaos aspect to this, is like being someone to destabilize. I'm curious if the Greenland thing is just another dead cat strategy. Nobody's talking about Venezuela now. And he's almost like, that's almost locked away and done. Does he even, I know the Arctic's a big deal. I'm not saying it's a complete play, but I wonder, they don't need to take in Greenland. They already have 2 bases there and can.
But then if it's all about deals, then what's the deal? What's the negotiation? What does America get to back down? Is it a bigger base? Is it greater autonomy? Is it greater freedom over military operations there? I don't know,
isn't it?
But the sense is that because he's approaching it in such an aggressive deal-making approach, then there is a deal to be made, and that then brings other people to the table, but it's on his terms.
Yes. You'll get almost anything you want short of actual full control of it or taking it over, and that'll feel like a good deal. And he'll be like happy as. So the other story I thought you were going to talk about, the Darlington nurses.
Oh.
Yeah, but anyway, you've missed your chance now.
Sorry. You can talk about the Darlington nurses.
We divvied them out. We thought, believe it or not, people, we actually sometimes structure these conversations, which was a big court case at the end of last week after we recorded. Again, this was a set of nurses who had taken their employer, the NHS, ultimately to court because they were being forced or obliged to use a changing room where there was a trans colleague, so somebody born male. And again, they were saying they weren't being protected in that. And it was a great victory for females. It was a great victory for safety overall. The other thing I think was worth noting is Christian Concern were behind this case. I think they handled this one well, and I don't always agree with them, and they know that, but I thought this one they did do well. And the faith element was clear but not dominant. And I thought it was really interesting, and J.K. Rowling and others were happy to tweet, not just in general about the case, but actually Christian Concerns tweet. They could have picked any story, and they're openly acknowledging the faith element. So again, for me, this is really interesting because it's the front end of the culture wars that is also a really missional moment, and people are okay with that we can talk about faith more openly in this conversation.
And it's interesting because some of the gender critical advocates that have led some of the legal battles haven't been Christian. They haven't been leading from a Christian worldview. They've been critical of a trans inclusive approach that rejects sex as biological. And many of the cases over the last few years haven't been faith driven, but this one and some others are. So it is interesting seeing that aspect of it coming through. The other thing that I would have said if I'd have stuck to
the script, Danny, that we sort of agreed.
I'm the one here without any notes, is that it is slightly different to the Nurse Peggy case in Scotland. Now, they both mostly won their cases, but actually the legal aspects of both cases are slightly divergent. So there's been a bit of discussion as to whether there'll be a bit of reckoning between those two cases as to where the law actually applies. What I read basically suggested that the Darlington case was in closer reading to the Supreme Court judgment, and actually more likely that the Nurse Peggy case might, on appeal, it might win more ground.
The Nurse Peggy case appears to be quite confusing, and it's had a number of revisions. I think it's up to 17 now. I mean, I think they've openly had to acknowledge that AI was used in part of it, and it doesn't seem to be as robust legally a decision. Yes. That's certainly my impression. Haven't read the full judgment that. I have looked at that one a little bit. But I think they're both really culturally significant cases. So the lawyer in me loves them, but actually I think they're having a big impact more.
And yet it's a stumbling block for the Minister for Equalities because she's yet to release guidance around the Supreme Court ruling around what is a woman. So I think that conversation is going to linger on in terms of how government responds to 2 court cases that have been challenged and support and that. So I'm
just
intrigued.
give us a sentence more for anybody who's not quite up to speed on that guidance.
So the Minister for Equalities is Bridget Phillipson. She's also the Secretary of State for Education, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission came up with their framework of how the government should now move forward in light of the Supreme Court ruling around biological sex as the definition within the Equalities Act, and what that therefore means in terms of single-sex spaces, where is it appropriate to apply different policy and guidance. And for whatever reason, the Minister for Equalities is pressing pause in implementing those guidance. But we have 2 cases within that time that have come to the fore to say, actually, we need to move forward on this. And for whatever reason, the minister is holding back in kind of setting the government's position on what that is going forward.
And part of the reason that's so problematic is lots of sort of bodies like the NHS are saying we're waiting for that guidance rather than rushing ahead. So there's the cases may have been successful, but there's been no change on the ground, or very limited, because everybody's understandably to some degree saying, well, we need this guidance to help us roll it out, rather than each one going off and creating their own. So it'll be interesting to see, and that we will keep you informed as and when that moves. We need to jump into our first kind of big story. We're on, should we be banning social media for under 16s? Danny, as the parent of about a full 4 or 5 two-year-olds or something. How's the social media usage of your two very young children?
Well, my 5-year-old daughter did partake in Safer Internet Awareness Week a couple of weeks ago. I might have got that a bit scrambled, and she came back home talking about how it was important to limit screen time, as well as get enough sleep at night and eat healthily. So the messages from school do come in at an early stage. So obviously social media in its normal format isn't an issue, but the proposals that are now being brought forward and are due to be consulted on imminently from the government are that social media will be banned for under 16s. What that means in practice, we'll have to see what their proposals actually lay out. If it's along the lines of the Australian ban, they named particular platforms. I think it was 10 platforms where users had to register and interact with other users. Those were the platforms that were banned. So under 16s could still view YouTube videos, but they couldn't be a registered user and comment and interact. WhatsApp was also not banned as part of that. So obviously the scope of something like this and what it actually means in practice will be really interesting. But there has been a lot of pressure, and the government had been resisting bringing this forward, and they seem now to have, once again, changed their approach and said that they will bring forward a ban.
Well, certainly going out to consult and definitely favouring it.
I think that would be their
direction.
policy direction.
Yeah.
But it is a contested space. We've got parents who've got interest in this on slightly different sides. You've got Molly Russell's father saying a ban's wrong. He doesn't want it. Molly Russell, you may remember, 14-year-old who killed herself, and the coroner found that Instagram was a significant influence in that moment. And I think largely his reason, from what I can see reading around it, is he thinks they're well on their way to better measures, and this is a bit of a sledgehammer to crack the nut, and they've been working quite hard to find better solutions. Though he is not, and NSPCC and a couple other groups are with him in that, others on the other side. Alicia, where are you?
I mean, I think as a conversation, it shows the challenge and also the reality for parents in wanting to be more involved in the lives of their children and have a real informed kind of understanding, knowledge, parenting and everything, but the challenges that technology brings with that. So social media is a good place for a level of connection and learning of the world, but it also has been shown to be a place of anxiety, a place of challenge. There's horrific incidences. You've spoken about a death that's taken place, and there's been other cases where other young people have been influenced negatively around self-harm and so on and so forth. I think the challenge for the government, which is why their policy approach is right, is where do you land on this? There is a limit to what government can do in terms of restricting legislation or restricting use for young people, working with tech companies to be enforcing this. I mean, we have the Online Safety Act that has go some way to addressing the online harms that impacts all of society, and particularly children and young people. I'm not sure a ban outright, this is not EA policy before we get any comments in our info box, is going to tackle what the government really needs to do, which is the cultural conversation around how does technology impact our day-to-day lives and living. And that's more of a conversation for one-on-one parents, family habits. I think it needs to be distilled in a space whereby there's real conversation and real challenge and real accountability, and there's limits to what government can do to that, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, and I think in the Battle of the Parents, it's Brianna Gay, I think is she is one of, I think, 8 parents who do want to see the ban, all of whom had kids severely impacted. In her case, her child was killed, and social media was a significant influence. So while we could have, in some sense, the Battle of the Parents here, I think there's a certain amount of they're going to take different sides on this. And I, as a parent, certainly agree. I'm interested in a ban. We don't have a position yet. It's something we'll all look to Danny and see what we're going to decide shortly. And we'll probably want to hear from you on that as listeners and other EA members around this, because we definitely have resisted and stopped our own kids, my kids, from having social media before they turned 16. They had a phone and they were engaging in some of those spaces. WhatsApp and Snapchat, in my view, is not a social media platform. At 16, and actually 6 months after her 16th birthday, my daughter's gone on social media. But there's definitely a movie in her friendship group. It's not quite as big a driver as it might have been. There's an awareness that this is more complex and they're not all rushing in the same way they were.
And that shows how difficult it is for government policy and legislation to deal with this. Because have we already gone past the peak problem? Are things getting better, both from a platform responsibility, but also from a wider cultural and social awareness of the problem, whether that's in schools, in families, just in general culture, looking at some of the problems, is it already getting better? And actually legislation is just too late. It's just too slow. It's just inefficient as a way of tackling it. That doesn't mean there isn't a role for that. I think broadly, a lot of people would agree that too much social media and certain types of social media can be harmful, can be damaging, can expose people to particular risks. And then the question is, well, what do you do about that? Like, it's not about denying the problem. It's just, how do you respond to that most effectively? And I think whether that's about school policies or just whether families have policies or just an approach, or how do you deal with it in your family setting? But it's also, let's think about churches as well. How are churches doing that? How are churches supporting parents in what they're doing? How are we helping parents to parent in a community so they're not just on their own in navigating things where they might receive pushback from their children, but actually what's the wider context? So overall, I kind of feel that the policy and legislation as a lever is just a bit slow in responding to these sorts of things. But it is certainly true that online activity, social media use, phone use is a driver of problems among young people. But it's then what is the best way of responding?
Yeah, I think Jonathan Haidt is brilliant for the information on this. He's got both a book and a website and really good intel, and done a lot of research on the impact. He'd be a big fan of moving to something like a ban, but again, largely driven by schools, and because it's very difficult for anybody on their own to step out of this, because peers, friends, colleagues, and so many schools drive so much things through the use of phones and technology. So he's got a wider conversation on the whole technology and kind of piece, not just social media. And I do think parents have to absolutely own this, and individuals themselves. But that is incredibly difficult if the school has Google Classroom from year 8 or 9, and you kind of then have to have some sort of way of engaging with that. And again, I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think the government is discussing schools as part of this consultation. I think that's incredibly important. But it's also a really interesting conversation piece. So on my way here this morning, very early in the airport, chatting to somebody straight away, he's having a conversation about the social media ban and about his, I think it's a 3-year-old daughter he has, but he just said they've already carved out a different way. It was a really interesting space. It's a guy I kind of regularly, because I go through airports too often. And we had this conversation. I was like, this is fascinating. He really wanted to chat about it. And I would say for us as Christians, this is a really interesting space to be saying, why do we think we would have hesitations, which is shared in my experience by many other parents? What is it, the content that's coming in? How are we doing parenting? How are we doing life? What does it look like to create communities, Danny, as you were saying, where we take a different way? And some really small practical things. Our kids in their youth kind of engagement in church would use Kahoot, really fun kind of quiz thing, but you need a phone to do it. So my wife's like, is it possible we could sometimes say, we're not going to do it. You don't need a phone. They can leave their phones behind and not have them that night. Because, of course, once they have them for Kahoot, that's their justification for bringing them in at all. And then all sorts of things happen. So could we have some spaces where you don't have that? And that requires a bit more creativity. But again, carving out to say, you can have fun for an hour and a half without a phone. You don't need it at all. And we can then help you enforce that. So
the other thing that I've been challenged about around this is how I use my phone around my children. Like, what habits am I modeling and practicing? And I've been quite challenged by this. I read stuff about people saying no phones in your children's bedroom, because if you're on your phone in your child's bedroom, they're going to just think you're not paying attention to them, or they're going to want to look at something or do something. Or like the other day, I was reading a random story about, I think it was about a youth hostel. Like, it was a really boring, innocuous thing, and my son was just, "What's that? What's that?" So I told him about it, but suddenly he was drawn to what was on my phone that I was reading about. And I was just aware that actually our practice, what we do, sets an example to children. And I think it's all very well to say, right, okay, we need to legislate and drive policy to stop younger people doing it. But actually what we do and how we model usage is crucial.
So you can get in touch. You can let us know, cross.section@eauk.org. If you've got some views on the social media debate in particular, because that is going to be a live consultation, and no doubt we will be responding in some way, shape or form. But we're into the big kind of political stories, defections galore. They all seem to be going one direction at the minute. Dan, I'm going to look to you to tell us who's defecting, if people don't know, because there's so many stories this week. And what do you think the impact of some of these defections are? We'll all get in on that one.
Well, the big one was last Thursday. Robert Jenrick, formerly the justice spokesperson for the Conservative Party, leadership contender, minister in previous Conservative governments. He lost out to Kemi Badenoch in the leadership election in 2024. He was sacked. He was sacked when aspects of his resignation speech were metaphorically found on the photocopier. Apparently, rumours that was one of his staff was a Team Badenoch supporter and sent the images across. Anyway, it came to light he was planning to resign. He was sacked. A few hours later, he was welcomed into reform at a press conference that was supposedly about local government elections. So he was the big name. Andrew Rosendale, another former Conservative MP, has also jumped ship. There have been others in recent weeks, mostly at a lower, less public profile. There's rumours of a Labour defection that may have happened by the time you listen or watch this podcast. But yeah, it's all in one direction. An interesting thing to me, though, is has this in some ways given Kemi Badenoch an advantage in her leadership of the Conservative Party? Robert Jenrick had been a very visible member of her team. She definitely took the approach that he was better inside the team than outside the team, but he was building his own profile. There was this feeling that he was waiting in the wings for her if she were to fail, that he would be the heir apparent. Does she now just have an easier job with him out? And do Reform have a problem when they're seen as a place for all of these former Conservative ministers, members of the former administration? Are they just disaffected Tories? And will that help their appeal or not?
Yes, is this just uniting the right? And, well, I mean, with Jenrick going, there's more pressure on Farage now. Can he cope with other big players? Danny Kruger ran, I think, Robert Jenrick's campaign.
Yes, he did.
So not a surprise in one sense, but Danny is not maybe as upfront a politician. So if Nigel can make a place for Robert Jenrick, that would make others maybe feel happier to move. If he can't, that would also be a litmus test on how serious he is about creating a new party. And just in passing, Danny, you did say it was supposed to be about the cancelling of the local elections, that press conference. And that in and of itself is a little mini story that's almost got lost, because both the main parties are kind of quite happy because of the rise of Reform and what we're seeing. But let's say, from your point of view, these defections, I mean, are we seeing a uniting of the right? Are we seeing a fundamental shift in British politics here?
I think we're still seeing a fracture of British politics at the moment. I think the defection, particularly of Jenrick, in terms of how it plays out longer term, I think it will impact Kemi more Yes, she showed strong leadership, decisiveness, as many are commenting. But the reality is that she has Conservative Party members as well as MPs who are saying we no longer have confidence in your leadership, no longer have confidence in your ability to win not the May elections that are coming up in Wales and Scotland or make inroads in local council elections, but actually the general election in the next 2 years. You're no longer the opposition party. And so I think longer term, it plays out in favour of what Nigel Farage is seeking to do, is to say we are the official opposition. We are the new right. This is the language that is coming out in terms of we are the kind of the centre-right party within British politics. How it plays out, I'm not quite sure. I was at kind of a roundtable conversation in the northwest of England this Friday, and many there were talking about how they feel as Christians politically homeless all the more. Because in terms of the defections that have taken to reform, you mentioned Danny Kruger. Yes, he might be behind the scenes, but he's been a credible politician. He's been very forthright with his faith. Tim Montgomery, he's not an MP or aspiring to be, but he's in the machine of Reform UK. And there are many Christians that are kind of moving over to Reform in terms of establishing centre-right politics with principles of Christian values. And so there's that presentation that this is a not overtly Christian organisation, but it's definitely has very strong leadership and people that speak to that, where Christians are thinking, do I vote Conservatives? Do I find my home with Reform UK? I have questions about Reform UK in terms of its makeup. And I think that's the challenge long term that's going to be played out for Christians in terms of, okay, the election isn't now, but in terms of when it does come, where does your vote lie? What are the principles? Where do you see your self-voting longer term? And at the moment, there's instability in Reform, there's instability in the Tories, and there's definitely instability in the government. So,
and there are other Christians who are saying it's almost anathema to vote for reforms. It feels like the camps are, it was acceptable. People thought, look, you might be Conservative, you might be Labour. I can understand there's a difference. It's now, if it's reform, that's almost unpalatable to some, and others are going, it's because so many Christians are moving that they think this is the right thing to do. So I think the fracturing even within church communities is getting a little deeper around these issues.
And that's certainly happening. And I think one of the questions is, well, is reform far right? Is it right? Labels of left and right do become really difficult because it's like, what is your criteria for deciding how right a party is? So I'm not going to get into that. It's interesting that there is a cohort of socially conservative voices. You mentioned Danny Kruger, Tim Montgomery, James Orr, key figures within Reform who are traditional socially conservative politicians or political people. But that's not the entirety of the party. Other bits of the party are much more populist or libertarian. If you look at Robert Jenrick or Nigel Farage or Nadeem Zahawi was the other person that defected recently. They fit different parts. They don't necessarily present the same approach. So one of my questions is, well, which bit wins out? Yeah. What is the leading edge of Reform as it presents itself to the public? Is it a socially conservative party? Is it a libertarian party? Is it a broad tent of the right wing? That comes back to where people think this might be an opportunity for Kemi Badenoch, that actually she can present a centre-right party. Actually, some people have been pushing her. Matthew Paris was writing in the Times about this as an opportunity for her to restore the Conservative Party where it belongs. Whereas other people think, actually, no, you don't want those left-wing Conservatives back in the party. You need to be further on the right. So the party is always a tension. That's politics. It's always a tension between different factions. But Reform are now wrestling with this, and how people respond to it and what people think about it will depend which bits win out. And for Christians looking at Reform, I think if you're on the right of politics, many will be thinking, would I vote for Reform or would I vote Conservative? And there'll be issues at play. For people who are on the left, who actually, while they might accept that Christians would vote Conservative, it might be like, oh, well, it's pushing it a bit too far for Christians to vote Reform. It's not like they would ever vote Reform, but they might acknowledge that Christians would vote Conservative. So I think it's not so much, well, are they going to win over all Christians? No, of course they're not. Christians and evangelical Christians have diverse political views. it's for those who are on the right of politics, that's where their political views sit. Are they drawn to reform, and what draws them there? And how is that going to work?
And we've talked previously, but a little less, I think, about the left and the Green Party, because the numbers we found in our own polling about the number of people. So it does feel like, yes, Labour and Conservative, you could see people shifting sides. We can see seats moving between them. Green to Reform feels like a very long distance, and yet we do know that a significant number of evangelical Christians, our own constituency, are voting for both of those parties, and it feels harder to reconcile how that's possible, and to hold churches that have people spanning those kind of spectrums is going to be more challenging.
Just to clarify, what we are seeing is a significant chunk of people moving away from both Conservatives and Labour, and where they're going to is Reform and Greens. So you're seeing that widening of the political spectrum.
And we do have a name for that. It is the Ulsterisation of politics, Danny, isn't it? That's or the Northern Irelandisation. Two different writers have coined those phrases, which is what Northern Ireland saw around the peace. The SDLP and the UUP, the more moderate parties, were dominant. And following our peace process, what we've then seen is a move to the extremes, to Sinn Féin and the DUP. And so that's where that phrase is coming from. We are seeing the middle being a harder place to hold, and the extremes looking in this moment a little easier, and the movement out towards them. We no doubt could talk about that for a long time, but you are listening to Cross Section. Thank you so much for joining us. It would be wonderful if you could like or review and share about us. That would be great. If you're enjoying these conversations, that would be incredibly helpful. Our boss was out somewhere recently and was just saying, he asked people what was the most helpful thing the EA was doing. And one person shot up their hand and said Cross Section. And sadly, the rest of the room, though, hadn't heard about it. But they all got out their phones at that moment and downloaded it. So I was both encouraged and discouraged in equal measure in that conversation. But if you do like what we're doing, please do share about it. Do get in touch at cross.section@eauk.org. Our final story is abortion statistics. And one of the reasons that I find this interesting in our kind of move is I do think I've spoken to people who are saying, how could anybody vote for example, Reform, and yet they're happy to vote for a party, either Labour or Conservative, that has whatever you want to call it, progressive, like is an accepting view on abortion. Their conscience votes, but the way those have actually been done means well, you and I have had a previous conversation about whether conscience votes have any meaning. But I think that's one of the reasons we want to talk about this, plus this set of statistics that come out this week. Delayed statistics. So, Alicia, do you want to fill us in on the kind of headline story that we're kind of discussing as we round things out?
Yes, so abortion statistics for England and Wales, published January 2026, although it's looking at the year of 23, so it was delayed. And just to kind of give the headlines of how horrific, and I will use that language because I think we the church need to grapple with the reality that abortion has for a long time remained in the shadows, where there is an assumption that abortion is not that prevalent, it's low numbers, and it impacts a very unique and specific section of society, when actually it's quite pervasive. And even though the law is being challenged at the moment, it's still unbelievably high. So here are the headlines that I think we need to reconcile with. In 2023, 277,970 abortions took place in England and Wales. It's the highest since the Abortion Act was passed in 1967. 11% increase from the year previously. That 11% in numbers is 26,593. The most dominant age or growth or increase is amongst 20 to 24-year-olds, is where there's the highest number of abortions. But actually, it's above 30s. I think it's 30s and over has the most consistent growth of or increase of abortion statistics that takes place. 98% of abortions are funded by the NHS. Majority of abortions are happening between 2 and 9 weeks. And Caroline Ansell, who works for CARE, deep dived into the statistics, and here are some of the other figures. 3,205 disability selective abortions, 300 late-term abortions for babies with disabilities from 20 weeks onwards, and 735 babies with Down syndrome were aborted in those statistics. And so the reality that abortion is very progressive, both in practice and in reality. It impacts every layer of society. It's taking place on demand, even though it talks about Ground C as the most prominent kind of place where abortions take place. Abortions, that's anything before 24 weeks. And the statistics come out. I think the shock for me that really, as I was reading it, is that statistic has passed before the Prime Minister, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. It's passed amongst some of our senior medical experts within kind of the NHS world, and all of them see it and say nothing and think, how is it that 277,000 plus abortions take place in a year, and it's on the rise? And what's worse is that the church in its collective are powerless to speak into this place and say abortion doesn't work for women, and it doesn't work for the unborn, and it most definitely doesn't work for the progressive agenda around sex and sexuality, in terms of everyone can have sex and there are no consequences. I think the church needs to lean in theologically, but also practically, that there are people in your pews that are struggling with the decision of possibly having an abortion, and the church doesn't know how to theologically speak into that space, but equally post support and care for people that may have come to faith and had a decision of abortion, and they themselves are having to reconcile with the ongoing either mental or physical health implications of that. So it needs to come out of the shadows and into the light for us to really grapple with this, and to actually conceive of a society where abortions do not take place on this scale.
100% agree. I think it's always worth restating that we are a massive outlier in the UK in the timeline that we allow this up to 24 weeks and now essentially decriminalized up to birth. Like, we are the crazy outlier. What we think is normal in a culture that you're raised in, particularly in GB, as in the mainland here, because Northern Ireland was different, is now aligned, sadly. But it's so we are a matter. Like 12 weeks is the kind of standard in most other countries if you're going to have this at all. And again, our numbers keep going up, and it's the 11% rise for me. I find all the numbers staggering, but that it's just going up. So this whole idea on the progressive side that it's safe, legal, and rare, this idea that if we allow this, we'll get it down and we'll be sensible, and it's not working.
That's gone out the window, though. That's 72% were at home via telemedicine, online or on over the phone appointments, 2 pills taken at home, and yet still, I read in The Guardian relating to these, abortion providers talking about problems of access to contraception and needing to widen access and ease of use of abortion. So there's still this feeling that, but then I also get the like, logically, people don't have an argument to oppose it. People look at the figures. Well, the law permits this, and the law will permit it in greater freedom. The decriminalisation of abortion is not quite through all its parliamentary process, but the law does. So where the problem is people aren't able to oppose it because actually, well, we've said this is okay. We've accepted it is okay. And I think that's where there is a need for a voice to speak up and challenge this idea that doesn't recognise the value of life before birth. It doesn't. There is no sense of protection for people with disabilities. Before birth, the law has repeatedly rejected that, that actually we talk about protecting and supporting people with disabilities. That only matters after birth. Before birth, that's just classed as irrelevant. And there's such huge inconsistency here. And actually the need to speak up. Right? We talk a lot about both lives, the lives of the mother and the life of the baby. And wanting to protect and promote both lives is so important because I think otherwise people don't have the tool to do that. As you said, the safe, legal, and rare. That argument doesn't make sense anymore in a progressive world. So actually, we need to be able to speak in a way that says, actually, we want to value life. We want to value all lives. We want to support mothers. We want to help people, perhaps who have had abortions and need support and care. But we also want to promote life before birth.
That's one of the problems with the progressive story is there's nowhere else to go. It keeps progressing, and I'm using that in inverted commas if you're not watching, we're basically up to birth now. We're decrim up to birth. As you say, disability is not protected. It's just blatant discrimination in our legislation against disabled people. It would never pass now the way it's written, this allowance out. And sex-selective abortion is clearly happening in the figures to say that, and they know it. And then telemedicine has pushed that, so it's now basically unsupervised, because telemedicine means it used to be you had to go see a provider. It used to be properly 2 doctors way back. Every step and every kind of safeguard has just been diminished. And we're now right up to, there's basically nothing left. And still the major providers are saying, we need to keep pushing that more. We need to allow more freedom around this. And the church has been mute. And I think we need to own that and say we have not got on the front foot and thought about this. And we have misunderstood, I think, how fundamental that is to every other dignity argument we want to make. Mm-hmm. And then this is fundamentally what it is to be made in the image of God, and to be known by him from the moment of conception, and then to articulate that well, acknowledging the massive pastoral implications of that. Mm-hmm. Because by running away from, I think one of the things is, well, it's too hard pastorally. And the majority of pastors are males. So they're like, I don't know if I can talk to this. And in doing so, they're also ignoring the massive pastoral challenge that is there. And we're not running away from that, but we've got to get on the front foot in this. And it's one of the reasons we'll talk about this, even though it's maybe awkward and maybe some of this is like, why are you guys on that again? Like, this is fundamental to human dignity. Our colleagues at Both Lives have got a podcast.
They do have a podcast, and they've written a kind of a summary overview of the recent abortion statistics that have come out. But as a final comment, and particularly for our listeners, and this is based off of a conversation and many that I've had with politicians on the centre left who are of faith, who say that, that they've fully subscribed to the narrative, my body, my choice, or actually, the rights of the woman in this place. And they can't conceive that abortion, one, doesn't work for women and most definitely doesn't work for the unborn. There's something about the left, those who sit politically on the left and who love Jesus. It's your voice that needs to lean into this, that both the pro-female argument of how abortion actually doesn't serve women well, how actually abortion for the most vulnerable, as in the life of the unborn, we need those voices within the church to have courage to speak into this place, because at the moment your silence is complicit in it. And that would be one of the challenges that I would love to speak out to that, because we're often accused that, evangelicals on the centre right only care about abortion because they're wanting to control women's bodies. No, actually, they say the injustices that are happening to both women, men and the unborn, and want to lean into that framework of actually what does it mean, both dignity and justice for all lives to be protected from conception to the end of natural death. And so that would be my challenge.
It is one of the biggest injustice in our world, and injustice is always preceded by an act of idolatry, where you put somebody or something before God. In that case, it's putting up ourselves, and that claim of my body, be it the trans conversation with the Darlington nurses or my body, my choice in the abortion. What is the most fundamental kind of, it's just like a sacramental moment in the secular culture, and it jars with, this is my body. That's Jesus' claim at communion. That's why I think communion is so important as a kind of response to this. This is my body. That's the sacramental moment in the biblical text. And our culture says, no, my body, my choice. And there's an absolute jarring in this moment between those. There is a clash going on, but it's a fundamental spiritual clash, because it's in the sacrament of him giving his body in communion. This is my blood poured out for you. That is our moment of reconciliation with Jesus in these most jarring of moments. And as I hear those cultural slogans that are really riffing and undermining that, I am reminded of that. And with that, we're going to leave you with that kind of, I suppose, a theological, biblical reflection, just as we come to the end of some of these cultural stories, as we constantly wrestle with how we bring these cultural stories into interaction with our faith. Thank you for joining us. We will see you again on the next episode. Be blessed.